Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for this incredibly intriguing webinar. I'm really excited to welcome Ken Pomeroy to the Weather Band to talk to us about his career and his experiences as both a National Weather Service meteorologist and a consultant for the NBA. So Ken Pomeroy has worked in basketball for 15 years, providing analytics for basketball teams through his website, consulting for NBA teams since 2003. Prior to that, he was a meteorologist with the National Weather Service after being a graduate student in atmospheric sciences at the University of Wyoming. So he's going to discuss his lessons learned from predicting the weather and how those have helped him succeed with basketball analytics. So we're really excited, Ken, that you could be here today. Thank you so much. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and I will help to relay those. And we'll also probably have time for a little Q&A at the end. So again, just put them in that Q&A box and we'll make sure to get to them. So without further ado, Ken, I will hand it over to you.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you guys today. Obviously I've been out of the meteorology game for a little while, but try to keep in touch with people, and this has really been a good opportunity for me to kind of reflect on some of the things I learned and dig into the science in a way that I haven't done in a few years. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody can see my screen or see my presentation here. I'll start off with maybe more of an extended introduction about myself. I am actually one of you. I did get a master's in atmospheric science from the University of Wyoming. I worked as a meteorologist in the National Weather Service for about 12 years, most of that as a forecaster in a forecast office. So, my passion is really in predicting things, and certainly had an interest in predicting the weather, and still do. And I had an interest in basketball, and really my interest there is kind of predicting both player and team performance, and a lot of my work is based around that, and certainly learning how to make forecasts for people in the meteorological world really shaped a lot of my work. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I also was an instructor at the University of Utah for 6 semesters, teaching an intro to meteorology course, a night course to mainly people who are not science majors. So that was probably the most challenging thing I did in the world of meteorology. And then I made the switch and jumped into basketball. So I've been full-time in analytics since 2012. I don't have a formal degree in basketball. When I was college age, those kind of degrees weren't really possible, and they're still not really possible, although I think more institutions are now offering like data science degrees that have specialties in sports. So, things that are, really geared towards a career in sports analytics. And most of my income is derived from the website I run called kenpom.com. So you can type that into your web browser of choice and kind of get an idea of what I do. But basically, I compute a bunch of statistics for men's college basketball teams, and coaches and media and fans pay a small fee to access that information. I also write for various outlets, most recently for The Athletic. I'm a consultant to an NBA team that will remain unnamed, but that's also a very fun work as well. And in that job, I mainly focus on the NBA draft and trying to predict the performance of potential draftees at the professional level. So when I do interviews with the media on occasion, they will go to a very modest Wikipedia page that I have, and a page I had nothing to do with, by the way, so it's like 70% accurate. But they will notice that I have a background in meteorology, and they will often ask me about that, and it's kind of with some surprise. I think it's such a crazy transition to go from from meteorology to basketball analytics. And in my mind, it's really not that crazy. There are some comparisons. There are some things that are similar to the two fields. There's some things that are not similar. But as a very high level comparison, I will contrast the fact that meteorology is governed by the laws of physics, and the atmosphere that you're trying to model is vast and maybe not literally infinite, but seemingly so. Basketball is a little different in that it's played by people and it's officiated by people, and people make mistakes, and you're trying to basically predict what those people are doing. So the atmosphere, if you had a perfect picture of the initial conditions and a perfect set of equations describing the laws of physics, you could make a perfect forecast theoretically, but it's really not possible when you're trying to predict the behavior of people. They are not bound by any laws of behaviors. Various players are more motivated than others. They might be injured on a certain day and still try to play through it. They might have like personal situations that cause them to maybe be not totally checked into how how well they could play in a particular game. And on top of that, you have officials, and I would submit that basketball is the most difficult sport to officiate. I'm willing to take nominations for challengers to that, but to me, the sport moves so fast. You can't wait 5 seconds to make a call. You have to make the calls instantaneously. The rules are often very difficult to interpret in real time, and while there is instant replay, it's not applied to all cases. It's just not realistic to apply it to every call during the game. The game would take forever. So officials make mistakes as well. So you can make a prediction for a game, and an official can make a bad call that it kind of changes the outcome of the game, and your prediction would end up being wrong. And that's frustrating in a way that I think a bad forecast in meteorology is not as frustrating. Obviously, you feel bad about those bad forecasts, but there's nobody, you can't blame it on an official or a person, really. You can blame it on a model that went wrong, which is not quite as useful. I would also add that basketball is technically governed by the laws of physics, as is everything, but it's just not something that is really pertinent to making predictions for how games or teams are going to perform. It also involves a vast and infinite domain space. For those of you that are not familiar with the sport, basically any country that has a decent population has a professional basketball league, and the NBA has players from dozens of countries that play in it. So when we're preparing for the NBA draft, we're not just considering people that play basketball in America, which is obviously going to be most of the people that get drafted, but there are players that come from every continent in the world and end up playing. So we have to manage data from a bunch of different leagues, and that's challenging. But I do think that's one way that meteorology actually kind of prepared me for a career in basketball. Is there's obviously way more data to manage in meteorology, so it's not such a challenge for me to worry about trying to collect data from the Danish basketball league or something. That's kind of small potatoes. So I'll jump right in now, and I like to rank things, and I like numbered lists, and so I'm going to talk about the 5 things for meteorology that has really helped me the most in my basketball career. These are in no particular order. They're more in order to kind of help the talk flow, but we'll get started in that right now. So the first thing that I kind of always think about when I'm trying to model something or really jumping into a new data set and how I might use it is the concept of anomalies and what's normal. And I kind of promised myself that I wouldn't say anything too controversial from a meteorological standpoint on account of just not sounding stupid. You guys are obviously active in the field and I'm not. And so I'll play it very close to the vest here, but I think it's safe to say that this concept on the screen is true. A high of 110 in Portland is more newsworthy than a high of 110 in Las Vegas. And the reason for that is, you understand that a high of 110 in Las Vegas at certain times of the year is pretty close to normal. A high of 110 in Portland is basically unprecedented, except for the summer. So the infrastructure in Las Vegas and the people of Las Vegas, are really kind of used to those kind of temperatures, and that's how the urban area there was designed. And in Portland, that is not the case. So a very hot day is much more impactful there than it is is in Vegas. And, that same concept really follows in somewhat different ways into basketball, where, everything has a normal. A lot of times I'm using, numbers and data that people, even in the game, aren't necessarily familiar with, some new stats we might develop. And it's important to always like have that context of, hey, what is normal in this situation? How unusual is this performance? How unusual is this number? That's something that is constantly on my mind when I have to interact with people who maybe aren't as familiar with my work as others. And this is a little bit of a tortured analogy here, but there are normals that are, I think, like correspond to the type of normals that you see in a weather sense. I mentioned there are leagues all around the world, and those leagues have different normals. If you ever check out like data from the Chinese Basketball Association, for one thing, they play 48-minute games, which is actually pretty unusual. The NBA plays 48-minute games as well, but most leagues play 40-minute games. So China plays 48-minute games. Their games are very high scoring. There's not much defense played in them. Lots of points are scored. So the leading scorers in the league have these just crazy scoring averages. The leading rebounders are averaging like 15 to 20 rebounds a game. And in the NBA, that would be like an amazing number. And certainly in other leagues that play shorter games, those numbers are unheard of. And so if you don't understand the normals, like, and the first time you look at those numbers, you're like, whoa, like that's an amazing player right there. He's averaging 20 rebounds a game. We ought to take a look at him. Well, then you realize that actually that's like not that unusual in that league. And so you really have to constantly think of that. So there are like geographic kind of normals in basketball. There's like seasonal normals in basketball, not necessarily, definitely not affected by like the angle of the sun as it is in a weather sense. But, as the season goes along, when the season starts, offenses are very rusty. They don't shoot as well. They commit a lot of turnovers. And as the season goes on, they get better and more polished. And so understanding how those stats change over the course of a season it can be useful. Eras have different normals. This is especially important. I think most people are familiar with the fact that the three-point shot has become much more influential in basketball than it was, when it was first developed or first started 40 years ago. 40 years ago, like 0 or 1 player on a team could shoot a three-point shot and make it at a decent rate. And now 4 or 5 players on the floor at a time can shoot the three-point shot and make it. And so that is like skewed a number of statistics. And so if you're trying to compare team statistics from this season to, even 10 seasons ago, like that was a little bit of a different era, and there's just a little bit of a different standard that you have to compare it to. And so kind of using anomalies is a way to obviously compare things on an apples to apples basis. There are other normals. I'm going to kind of cease the tortured analogy here, but like positions have different normals. If a 6'2" point guard averages 6 assists per game, that's not particularly exceptional. But if a 6'11" power forward averages 6 assists per game, like that's a big deal. Like bigger players are typically not great passers. And so that's something that you'd really want to take note of. Players and coaches have different normals as well. So, sometimes, a coach playing at implementing a certain style that may not be unusual in general will be unusual for that coach. And so kind of understanding that background is important as well. So that's the case with anomalies, but the more interesting part of my work, I think, is the probabilistic part. And certainly that's like the most profound part when it comes to what I learned from meteorology. You obviously, working as a forecaster, you make forecasts every day. It's a much more, profound experience trying to make forecasts for people who inevitably are going to care about the weather at some point, whether they know it or not. And when you make a bad forecast, you develop a certain humility in terms of what your, predictive abilities are. And it forces you to think probabilistically. And you obviously intuitively understand why when we forecast precipitation, we're thinking of probabilities. It obviously frustrates the public at times, but that's, kind of how it has to be based on the state of the science. So in terms of probabilistic forecasts, I just want to make this kind of comparison when it comes to basketball or sports in general. The main reason sports are interesting is because the outcome of a game can't be predicted with certainty. And if the best team always won, like nobody would watch games. Like we wouldn't care. We want to be surprised. Those are kind of the memorable moments we have, is when surprising things happen in sports. Or if you're not into sports, you think, whatever your favorite TV show is, like when you get surprised watching a TV show, like that is why you're watching. And so sports are really kind of the ultimate in terms of, reality TV. It's just stuff happening with two teams competing, and sometimes the underdog surprises the favorite, and that's what makes it interesting. On the flip side, like meteorology, obviously you get surprised all the time in that as well. In an effort to not try to be too snarky here, I think it's fair to say the reason, like a dog, I would make a dog time out here. Time out for my dog. All right. Sorry, buddy. Okay, so the reason forecasts are sometimes criticized is because the weather can't be predicted with certainty. And, people want, if you're going to go out there and forecast a 20% chance of rain and somebody plans an 8-hour hike and they end up, getting a downpour, like they're going to be very upset. They don't like to be surprised in that context. But in both cases, establishing accurate probabilities is important. And the question is, how do we do that? And that's something that, has been an issue in meteorology. A lot of people have dedicated their time to figuring that out. And certainly once I got into sports and making predictions and making probabilistic predictions for sports, that's been a kind of a focus of mine as well, is how to create reliable probabilities for certain things. They can be very challenging. One way that we've tried to do it in meteorology is through ensemble forecasting, and it certainly makes sense from a theoretical standpoint. Multiple independent forecasts are going to be better than a single forecast. So multiple forecasts can give you an idea of uncertainty in a way that a single forecast really cannot. The problem is that achieving independence among forecasts is really difficult. It's been an issue with meteorological ensembles for a long time, and it's certainly an issue in basketball as well. There's multiple like ratings of college basketball teams out there. The NCAA uses these ratings in their selection process for the NCAA tournament. My rating is a part of that. There are 6 different ratings that are involved. I've made the case they should expand to more than that, because one outlier can kind of skew an average of 6 ratings. But nonetheless, we still get into trouble where 2 or 3 systems out there are very similar in their methodology, and they give similar results. And you might think, wow, all these 3 systems have this team ranked really high, so I have confidence that they're ranked really high. They're a really good team. But because the systems are of similar origin, like they're not truly independent forecasts. So it's an issue in basketball, as it is an issue in meteorology. This topic, in preparing this talk, kind of forced me to dive into the old spaghetti plots. Who doesn't like a good spaghetti plot in the middle of a lecture? And yesterday I was pulling up. It's kind of exciting around here. I live in Salt Lake City out west, and it looks like we're getting our first closed low dropping into the west this season. So after a long, boring summer, the weather starts to get interesting. So I pulled up the ensembles from the GFS 6-day forecast, so middle of next week, and you can see the spaghetti plot has a bunch of closed low type contours over the west. And then on the right is the mean height and spread, and reflecting again, the closed low over the west. The spread, as is typical, as I kind of always remember it, is usually in areas where the height gradient is tightest, and I never really felt like that spread metric gave me as much information as I really wanted. I mean, obviously there's going to be more uncertainty where you have kind of these fast moving tight gradient features. So I'm still left wanting by looking at ensembles, and as I mentioned, this is ensembles are probably still under dispersive in meteorology. Again, having been out of the science, I hesitate to make too many bold claims here. I could be wrong, but certainly that is an issue in basketball as well. Is ideally, having multiple independent forecasts is great, but typically those forecasts end up invariably using similar methods that lead to a lack of independence in those forecasts. So I guess the next thing that comes to mind are analogs. And this is something that is really, I think, one of the biggest things that's like similar between, or at least really helped me. It's something that's used in meteorology that is also used pretty heavily by people in basketball, that has really kind of helped me maybe advance the science in that respect on the basketball side. And I love analogs. Like, the range of future outcomes is unknowable, but if we can look at past situations with similar initial conditions, we can cheat. Cheat's kind of a derogatory word, nothing illegal about our cheating, but we're kind of taking a shortcut maybe past more like theoretical science that you get from the ensemble process, and just kind of using the vast amount of data we have from past forecasts to assess a true range of uncertainty. So the comparison here is, meteorology, there are model analogs. You can take a look at a model forecast for, we just pretend like we're looking at that forecast 156 hours out, and look at all the forecasts in the past that have had, a similar structure in the height field or other fields, and see how those forecasts ended up verifying, and then what happened on the ground from those forecasts. Basketball uses a really similar approach, and it's unique among sports in that you talk to scouts, and invariably, if you're talking about a player, a prospect for the draft, they'll always want to compare that player to a past player. And this is something I don't see in other sports. Like baseball maybe does this a little bit, but for the most part, with other sports, you just take a player and judge them on who they are. But in basketball, there's always this comparison that happens, and it's not very scientific, and sometimes it's not objective. Certainly, if you the people that do it in the public are pretty bad at it. They tend to do player comparisons almost by how a player looks. Does a player look similar to this player in the past? And really, if you want to do it right, you want to compare a player to like similar attributes. So they have similar athleticism, similar types of athleticism, similar skills, similar age, similar dimensions. Those are the things that we should be looking for in player comparisons. And some people do it really well. It just happens that most of those people are, working for teams, and so you don't see their work publicly. But the real challenge is that you want to find a player. Basically, the idea is you find a player in the past, and like, okay, now we know this player from 10 years ago is very similar to this current player we're evaluating, and we can see how that player's career did from 10 years ago. And maybe this player will follow a similar career path. Now we have some like additional information. The idea is noble, but oftentimes the process is not very scientific. And you think about the idea behind model analogs. We're looking at multiple forecasts from the past that are similar. With player analogs, oftentimes the scouts that suggest these are looking at one or two players from the past, and so you don't get a range of outcomes that you really could benefit from if you had a longer list of players. But in either case, if you certainly, I think from the meteorological side, you get what I call a more realistic ensemble. You get a true set of possible outcomes, and to me, like that was something very desirable in the basketball world as well. So it's something that I've worked on over time. I don't know what the state of the art is in analogs now. I went to the SIPS analog page. They still seem to be doing great work. Pulled up the precipitation over the West for the next 72 hours and discovered that the mean precipitation from the analogs was like 1/4 of an inch, and depending on where you are in the country or the world, maybe that seems like not very much precipitation, but out here it's actually pretty significant, especially since we've been in a drought. And figured using that information, I could turn off my sprinklers for the season and save a little bit of water. And so that's how I use that information. And I think this approach is especially useful for 5, 6, longer range forecasts. Obviously, it's hard for a human to infer uncertainty looking at a 7-day forecast or day 7 forecast. But using the analogs, you kind of scientifically can derive some uncertainty from that. So the same idea I've tried to apply to basketball, and this is the only time I will show an image from my site. Not intending this to be a commercial for my site, but this is some of the work I do both on my site and in my MBA consulting is cranking out analogs for players based on statistics. There's a lot of numbers on here, and I'm not going to go over that, and they're not terribly important, but just know that I am comparing this player named Joshua Primo to all the players who previously existed since over the last dozen years or so, in terms of how similar they are statistically, how similar they are in terms of age, in terms of height, in terms of weight, and in terms of other aspects of how they play that are not shown on the screen. And this list is a list of the 10 players most comparable to this guy. So if you're a casual basketball fan, you probably haven't heard of this player, but he actually was picked 12th in the NBA draft this past summer. He was a freshman at Alabama, and he played a very specific role for them. He's a very young player and played on an experienced team, so he wasn't very involved in the offense. When he did get involved, there was obviously signs of potential, but it was really hard to kind of tell, what he might project going forward. And coming up with like player comps for him was very difficult. And anyway, the 10 most similar players are listed here, and there's a variety of players. Chris Middleton, if you're a fan of basketball, you've probably heard of him. He's been in some all-star games. So Josh Primo ended up being as good as Chris Middleton, you would feel pretty good about things. Kevin Herter's had a pretty good career. He was drafted in the first round as well a few years ago. But some of these other guys, even if you're a really hardcore fan, you haven't heard of these players because they didn't get drafted in the NBA, they didn't play in the NBA, and they just weren't noteworthy. But this does give you, I think, a good feel of the possible outcomes for this player. Like the most similar player ended up being an all-star, so that's great. Like you're picking him 12th. And by the way, it was a big surprise he got picked 12th. Like at the beginning of last season, nobody really even thought about this guy getting drafted or even coming out for the draft. And then, he had an okay season. People kind of liked him. And then he declared for the draft, kind of bet on himself, got drafted really high. It's a great story for him. Like he, kind of took a risk and it paid off. But ultimately you can see there's a lot of possibilities for him. He's a very young player. So you'd expect that too. Like the younger the player, the more they're in their development curve, and you don't know if they're going to develop, in the best case scenario or a worst case scenario. But the best case scenario based on history is an all-star, and the worst case scenario is going to be somebody that doesn't ever really contribute. And that's kind of the power of these analogs. And by the way, like I'd say 10 analogs isn't even enough. And I compute 50 analogs behind the scenes. So I have the 50 most comparable players to this guy. And then I can compute, what the average is, the average career is for that guy, or what the peak is, or what the 90th percentile is. And so it's really, really useful in a way that like, a human scout couldn't produce. One more guy, like who's kind of in an extreme, but even if you're not a casual basketball fan or you hate basketball, you've probably heard of this guy, Zion Williamson. He was, a generational athletic freak. Got picked number 1 overall in the NBA draft, and all the players he compares to are, all of them played in the NBA. That's what this NBA depiction means here next to each player. However, none of these players are like superstars, which is kind of interesting. And the fact is, like, there are actually no good analogs for Zion Williamson. Just because he's a 6'7", 285-pound person. Most of the time, those people are not in shape and they can't move very well. They don't have any touch and they get torched defensively. But Zion Williamson, as I said, a generational athletic freak who could carry this weight and was very quick on his feet, has great touch and great power, and just has like all the athletic tools that you'd want. And so this is a case where even though the analogs maybe tell you something surprising, like, yeah, he's going to play in the NBA, but none of these players ended up being that great. None of them are going to be Hall of Famers, at least. There's some good players on here, but, there's a score here for the analog. How close is the analog to Zion Williamson? And 832 is actually a pretty low score for the best analog on the list. It's actually like one of the lowest scores you'll ever find. So there's really nobody comparable to this guy, which is some information that's useful as well. Like I think people understood that too, but it's kind of good to see the system recognize that. Like, hey, this guy's like super unusual, and there's really no good comparison to this guy. I'll close it out by talking about this topic, which is the role of people versus, I don't know how to describe it. Computers, I guess, is the best way to do it. That's kind of a stereotype. Like, I don't know if you saw the movie Moneyball, but there's some scenes in there. It's basically a movie about how data is kind of driving this baseball team to do better things, and it's also kind of like showing how the scouts are simpletons and make judgments based on how good looking a player's girlfriend is and things like that. And it was an exaggeration, a big time exaggeration of what really happens. But there has always been this kind of tension between people and analytics or computers or the models. In the case of weather, like that was certainly something that struck me when I was in the field. Was there was always this tension between people and the models, and the forecasters. A certain set of forecasters were always trying to beat the models, and the models weren't always looked at as like your friend, which they were your friend. Like you actually couldn't possibly make a forecast without models. So we've grappled with this issue for decades. How what's the forecaster's role in the situation where the models are really, really good, and you ultimately like aren't adding value by trying to beat the models. And again, trying to not make it's not my place here to make bold statements about the future of meteorology, but certainly people are better at than computers at communicating future threats. They're better than computers, I think, at still better at reacting to short-term changes, interpreting radar information and things like that. And computers are clearly better at people when it comes to managing large amounts of data. I would say being unbiased, and I put a question mark by that because obviously computers are programmed by people, and people might have biases that end up in the, in the models or whatever. And then, no wish casting, and computers are, they don't have hearts and feelings, at least not yet. So, they don't care. I kind of liked, cold air and snow in the winter, and maybe subconsciously I would kind of lean my forecast towards that, but computers don't really care about that. And that's really where they're generally going to be better than people. So, I kind of think about these issues that we dealt with in meteorology and think about it in sports and in basketball in particular, because we kind of have that tension as well. Like, scouts are really valuable, and people's decisions are still really valuable. And there's always going to be a role for people in the sport. But I think coming from meteorology, I kind of have this like unique like sympathy for, there is this tension, and there is maybe a little bit of resentment in terms of, from scouts in terms of maybe data, driving too many decisions. So where are people better than computers in basketball? Well, really, I'm always impressed with how well scouts like identify the skills and characteristics for future success of a player based on a small sample. They can go to some game in, Latvia or whatever and watch a tournament of 18-year-olds from a bunch of players that they really haven't seen before, and they can kind of immediately pick out, the one or two players that had the best chance to make the NBA in 5 years in a way that, there's no way I could do that. And even with data, even if I had data from that event, like I probably wouldn't do a very good job of making that prediction. So there's always going to be a role for scouts in that sense. But what scouts can't do is see a lot of games. Like there's, as I mentioned earlier, the domain is vast and infinite. Like there's games going on in every country all the time. And computers can see those games, at least in terms statistically, they can see them. They can't see them with the detail that people can see them. Again, that's where people really have an advantage. But computers are certainly able to grab the statistics from those games and identify players that maybe we should be watching, and then we can send people to those games. We can send people to Latvia and say, hey, this kid like produced some really good statistics over the last 20 games. Maybe you should check him out and see if he has what it takes to be somebody we should be tracking more closely. So, I think the movie Moneyball implied that, eventually scouts would be extinct, and maybe they will in baseball. I don't know as much about baseball as I do about basketball, but certainly in basketball, I can't really see, that ever happening. Just like I can't really ever see like the forecaster becoming extinct in meteorology, because there's always going to be things that they can do better than computers. And the last two things on this list are the same thing that I mentioned in meteorology. Computers are not going to be biased. And that, we're dealing with people now, where in basketball, in meteorology, you're dealing with, parcels of air or whatever. So it's kind of impersonal. But, when you deal with people, and when I watch a game, I'm invariably like, attracted to a player who, plays a certain style, who really hustles and plays with a lot of flair and is really athletic. And I want to see that player succeed. And then maybe at some point you meet that player, you have a conversation with them. It's like, wow, this guy's a good dude. Like, I'd really like to see this guy succeed. He's obviously going to work hard. He has a great attitude. And you might learn about his background and find out that he overcame a bunch of obstacles in his life that were just unthinkable, and he ended up being a good person. And you want those players to succeed. However, if they can't play the game very well, if you continue to draft those players, your team's not going to be very good, and you're going to be out of a job. So it is important. It's not nothing wrong with having feelings and rooting for guys to succeed who are great stories. But in terms of selecting players for your team, you do have to get really focused on what they can provide in terms of in production. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Happy to take your questions. Hopefully you learned a lot about the common traits between my meteorology career and basketball. And I really feel like, I wouldn't have the success that I've had, whatever success I've had in basketball, without having gone through the forecasting process over and over again in meteorology. It was, I think something unique for people in my field.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. That was really, really fascinating. I love how you mapped the process that you go through with basketball into the weather prediction process. So I never considered any of that. So it was really neat to hear how you do that, and how many kind of parallels there were that you found. One of the things I thought was really interesting is like kind of the stakes that are so different though between like a forecast and between the forecasting for basketball.
Right. Yeah, it's really like that's the one thing, people will ask, do I miss meteorology or whatever? And I do. Like the stakes are like they're clearly more profound in a weather forecast. You're literally saving people's lives at times, and often, just making people's days better if you give them good information, just in terms of the general public. And certainly there's like, when you're dealing with, uh, other stakeholders like, fire weather and things like that. There's really significant benefits to doing good work. And in basketball, there's obviously, you're improving people's lives as well. But I don't know that I've ever, saved anybody's life forecasting a basketball game. So it's a fun challenge, but it is a little more trivial. And I kind of do really miss, the really profound aspect of making a good weather forecast.
I'm sure for some fans out there, it does feel like a matter of life and death.
It does for some, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Some people take it very seriously.
All right, we had a question from Eli. Do computer programming techniques from meteorology directly relate to basketball prediction programming? And also, do you have predictions for this year's Final Four and national champions?
Yeah, so I would say, I wish I knew, like, I'm a way better programmer now than I was, 10 years ago when I was a meteorologist. And I thought I was really good 10 years ago. but knowing what I know now, it's kind of laughable looking back on that. Yeah, I wish I had that knowledge, but I think techniques are pretty similar. Like once you know a language, whether it's Python was used pretty heavily back when I was a meteorologist, and now I've kind of gravitated more towards using R in some of my statistical analyses. But once you know a language, like you can use that as a hammer to whack a lot of different problems in a lot of different disciplines. So I think it's very similar. I would say as far as predictions, predicting the Final Four, as I mentioned, I'm definitely more into probabilistic predictions. So I try to avoid making the deterministic predictions, which are kind of foolish at this point. But Gonzaga seems like the best bet to win the national title at this point. But obviously, there's a lot of games to be played, and that's part of the fun, is that all sorts of crazy things happen. So I'm really looking forward. I'm really looking forward to a full season. That's kind of the main thing this year.
Absolutely. Yay, full seasons. All right, Bob is asking, how closely do you follow foreign pro player Jerome Randall, who was the player of the year for the Pac-12 in 2010?
Yes. I'll be honest, I don't follow him too closely, but that's a great name from the past. Former player at Cal, but that's actually a lot of, I think a lot of my work is trying to wrap my arms around who some of these players are internationally that might be, prospects that we can bring back to the NBA. It's a lot of my work. A lot of it's age dependent too. So it's, it's basically guys that are, almost always, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out of college. Once you get past that, they're usually not very realistic options to bring back. There are some exceptions, but yeah, that's part of the fun of it, is people, following international basketball is the closest thing I get to like the data challenges that you have in meteorology. In fact, I created the model I use to forecast the futures of some of these players in international leagues. I call the global model, which is like kind of a takeoff of the GFS. It's like that's my last connection, I think, to meteorology, is kind of naming things after meteorological models.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I thought when you were talking about knowing the local context for these different leagues and how important that was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, there's like local climatology in a way, even in the US. When I'm dealing with a college game, there's 32 different conferences, and they each have kind of their own normals for certain things. So, a high scoring game in one conference might be not as unusual as a high scoring game in another conference. And those are things that digging into the data as much as I do, like I kind of pick up on that pretty quick.
Yeah, it's amazing how much data you were discussing and how much more can be unearthed the more you look into it. But,
yeah, I didn't even, touch on the fact that you compare the model situation Really, I think in basketball right now compared to weather, we're probably like in like 1975, like weather-wise, like we've kind of just developed like primitive, radar that we use. We have player tracking for the NBA. So we have data now like on XY coordinates on where players are like every moment of the game. It's more two-dimensional than three-dimensional, but that's become useful, and that's opened up like a whole new area of kind of employment for people. We need analysts to analyze that vast amount of data. So we're way behind where weather is in terms of modeling, but the future is very interesting.
Right, we have another question. This one, or I guess this is two questions from Corey actually. Do you have any interest in expanding these capabilities to other sports?
I do. The problem is like basketball takes a lot of work. So, what I didn't mention in my bio is, there was about 5 years there where I was doing full-time meteorology and full-time basketball, and kind of tearing my hair out trying to balance those two things. And if I picked up another sport, and I've been tempted to for sure, because I do have interest in other sports, and I'm doing basketball for a long time. A lot of the mysteries around basketball have kind of, I don't say been solved, but there's just less like interesting knowledge to be gained. I feel like now that I've done this for so long, but it's so much work just to do basketball that I don't think I could do justice to another sport.
All right, and then the second part to his question from a minimizing bias perspective, do you have any thoughts on introducing feedback mechanisms, i.e. feedback from scouts, similar to how MOS guidance is computed?
Yeah, we talked about, like grading scouts. Scouts give feedback on players, and some of it is qualitative, but some of it's quantitative. We try to get scouts to quantify things, and you could grade them on how well they do. I think that would be pretty useful. But again, trying to go back far enough to do that and trying to quantify things in a way that are unbiased is pretty challenging. It would definitely be useful. Like that would be the ultimate, is getting these kind of human grades into a system, because I do think there's value there, and we'd also just get a handle on like how good they are at their job, better handle. I mean, I think they're pretty good, but we'd know like how much should we value this stuff? Do we value it too much? Do we value it too little? Like that would be really interesting information, but it's a very, very complex task.
And one other question, what about stats on coaches?
Yeah, that's actually just did a project for a coach who was kind of interested in his own stats. And this will occasionally come up, like coaches will be looking for jobs and they'll kind of want some information from me on how well they do certain things. Really for their own, either their own self-evaluation or just kind of put on their virtual resume to kind of sell themselves in terms of what they might bring to a program. So the stats on coaches are mostly like how their teams do. What are the trends in those teams? What are the things they do well? What are the things they don't do well? What are the styles that they tend to play? It's mostly that kind of thing. But since I do deal mostly with college basketball, and obviously college players are not sticking around very long. They're only there 4 years at most usually. Coaches are the one constant, and they're the one thread that you can tie from teams across eras. So yeah, I do quite a bit of work dealing with coaching stats.
Very cool. Well, it sounds like there's an immense amount of data that you already work with, and a lot more kind of development of that to come. So I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it seems like there's always more data being collected, and there's data now where you're in teams are practicing, and there's ways that there's systems out there that collect data on the players, the shots that they're taking, whether they're going in, how they're missing them, left or right or long or short. Like all that data is being collected kind of automatically right now. Certain teams have that implemented in their practice. So that data is pretty fascinating as well to kind of figure out, how well players are shooting, but also for the players that aren't shooting that well, maybe there's ways to, correct what they're doing when they miss, and help them improve.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we had one other question, sorry, about programming. Again, they were
Oh
asking, you
yeah,
mentioned Python. Do you use MATLAB at all,
I
or
d-
it
not used
mostly R?
MATLAB. No, no, I have not used MATLAB since I was in school, but Python, I don't personally use it very much, but it is very popular. Um, R is very popular. Database. I use MySQL, so kind of understanding SQL syntax is very important. Database design is important. All the things that you need to kind of manage and interpret large data sets are things that are applicable. And there's not necessarily one approach that I would advocate over another. I got sucked into R because it was open source and cheap and well supported, and it's worked well for me. But certainly people use Python or SAS or other tools, and they can all lead you down the same path of success.
Very cool. All right, I think that brings us to the end of our questions. So thank you so much, Ken. We really appreciate you being here today and giving us some really fascinating talk.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It was great to chat with everyone. And my email address is there on the screen, so you can hit me up if you discover you have more questions later.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming to the webinar, and we hope to see you in the Weather Band community. Take care.